Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Marilyn Shannon, and this is the Breaking Free Show. And I am so delighted to be here with you today. Happy that we have this time together each and every week to enhance our lives. Talk about some things that maybe we don't always talk about, but is interesting and helps us in our life in breaking free. So before I introduce my guest to you today, I want to say hi to Amnan. Hello.
Hello, Marilyn. How are you? I love your hair like
You
that.
do?
I do.
It was a
That's
magazine
nice.
picture. You like? Thank
Yep.
you for saying that.
Yep.
I appreciate it. And, you know, you come on the show, you want your hair to look nice.
It.
Sometimes it doesn't always look as great as you want it to look, but you know what? You just got to say the show and the content is much more important than my bangs.
Mhm.
So anyway, yeah, it's good. I like it. I'm
Nice.
happy with it. Did you have a good weekend?
I had a great weekend.
Yeah. I spent the weekend with my
We
grandsons.
I was doing
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
We were working outside. I mean, everything
Well,
all
we had
around. It
good
was good.
weather.
Yep.
We had really good weather. So it was a great weekend. I got to spend some with my 3 little grandsons, which was always adorable. So it was fun. Okay, on with the show. So we have a special guest today who is Gerald, and I hope I pronounced his last name correctly. Pro Prokopowicz. Is that good? From now on, I'm calling him Gerald. All right, got over
Jerry
with
is
that.
even better.
Huh?
Jerry would be even better.
Jerry. Oh, I like Jerry. Oh, we're getting real friendly here, Jerry. All right. Jerry is an expert on Abe Lincoln, which I am really excited to talk about, hear about, and learn about. Because it just so happens I was listening to a debate last night and I heard someone say that his role model was Abe Lincoln. Go figure, because of how Abe Lincoln handled things. So it's so interesting to go back to go forward, I think. So remember, anytime during the show, you can call in at 919-518-9773. That comes right into our studio. Or you can also connect with us in our chat and just put your name underneath our video and you can come in there, ask questions, comment, whatever you like. And also on Skype voice at computers, that's plural 2K voice. So we're ready to go. Jerry, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Marilyn. Appreciate being here. I worked on my hair all morning to make sure that I could live up to the standards of the program.
You look
Marvelous.
marvelous, honey, marvelous. So it's very exciting. Jerry is a professor from East Carolina University and is here to talk about Abe Lincoln and share, you know, about the Civil War and Abe Lincoln. And I know there's so much for us to learn. So tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I currently teach history at East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina. I've been here since 2003. Before that, I was the historian in residence at the Lincoln Museum in Fort Wayne, Indiana. That museum at the time was the largest museum dedicated to the life and times of Abraham Lincoln. Unfortunately, it's no longer open. The museum closed in 2008 after 80 years of operation. But I've continued to study and teach about Lincoln in my role as professor now, and also by writing books and otherwise continuing the research and presentation of Lincoln information.
So first of all, what hooked you into Lincoln? I mean, you had all these people to choose from in history. Why Lincoln?
Well, originally, my historical interest wasn't so much Abraham Lincoln as the Civil War itself, and that goes back to when I was 9 or 10 years old, and my family was making a car trip from Michigan to Washington, D.C. to visit some friends. On the way home, we stopped at the battlefield at Antietam in Maryland, the site of the great battle, September 1862. I don't know quite why my parents did this. They were both teachers, high school teachers, but not history teachers or especially history enthusiasts. But I guess I just wanted my brothers and myself to learn about anything. And so we stopped at this battlefield and I was mesmerized. The It was a November day, it was cloudy, it was cold, there were very few visitors that day. And it was just the ghosts of the soldiers who'd fought there and the civilians who lived on the farms there, and me. Didn't even know my family was still there. I was just taken by it. So I studied Civil War from then on through college. I majored in history, studied at the University of Michigan, and thought about a career studying the Civil War. But there are not many jobs for professors. There weren't then when I graduated from undergrad in 1980. There aren't many jobs today, unfortunately. So I went to law school instead. Ended up learning a different way of thinking. I think legal study is a fascinating thing, but practicing law, there are a lot of lawyers out there, it turns out, and possibly not, the world would not feel the pain of losing one of them. So I ended up deciding to go back and study what I was passionate about, which was the Civil War. I went to graduate school, and that's where I encountered my graduate advisor, David Herbert Donald. He had written about the Civil War. He'd written a biography of Charles Sumner. And most specifically, he was at that time in the 1990s working on his biography of Abraham Lincoln. And up to this time, I had not really thought of Lincoln as especially interesting. He seemed just so larger than life, so superhuman that the human interest wasn't really there. But working for Professor Donald as a research assistant, I began learning more and more about Lincoln and discovered something different about him. He was the first historical figure that I studied in a professional sense as a graduate student, later a professional historian, where when you peel back the layers and you find out they're not all they seem to be, there's all these human flaws underneath. With Lincoln, he really was what he seemed to be. His nickname was Honest Abe. He really was honest. They called him the Great Emancipator. He really did contribute to emancipation. He really was much of what his reputation said that he was. And this is unusual for historic figures. So it was working with Professor Donald on his biography of Lincoln that first got me truly interested and absorbed in the study of Lincoln. And I went on from there to work at the Lincoln Museum, eventually come here to ECU. So that's what brought me to this topic.
So I have two questions. The first question is, so Jerry, was there a particular focus that you took on that you were most interested in when it came to Lincoln, as opposed to what your professor mentor did?
I'm particularly interested in the military side of the Civil War. So that intrigued me perhaps more than the attention it got in Professor Donald's biography. But I would say a better answer might be what interests me now is the way that Lincoln is understood by the American public, the way he's been remembered since 1865 up to the present. The fact, as you mentioned, he still gets talked about in political discussions today in 2019 shows that people are still interested, people are still aware, take Lincoln seriously. And in my experience working at the Lincoln Museum, I got to encounter not other professors or even college students, but just everybody, the general public coming to a museum, school kids, families, all kinds of people visiting, all interested in Lincoln, and all with questions and all questions that were not necessarily the same as professors might ask. Mm-hmm. So I'd say my real interest is in how Lincoln is perceived by the public.
So how is he perceived by the public?
Well, that's a great question. What's interesting about it is there's no one answer to it because it changes over time. If you go back and look at Lincoln immediately after his death, there's of course immediate outpouring of outrage in the North, a fair amount of secret celebration in the South, although it was kept largely under wraps. But Lincoln's reputation as the great emancipator, as the savior of the Union, thrives for a time. Reconstruction comes and goes. By the 20th century, much of the promise of the Lincoln administration, especially the ending of slavery, seems to have been thwarted. Jim Crow takes effect by the 1890s. Former slaves or their descendants are treated as second-class citizens. By the 1920s, by the time you've got the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, Lincoln's reputation as emancipator is largely downplayed because emancipation doesn't seem to have worked out very well. And instead, he's remembered as the savior of the Union. By the 1950s, you get the second Reconstruction, you get Brown versus Board of Education, you get the end of Jim Crow. By the 1960s, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. You've got a new focus on equality, and Lincoln suddenly does seem to have accomplished something through emancipation. So you get a different vision of Lincoln. Mm-hmm. You also get a disillusioned vision of Lincoln at the same time. Many people see that Lincoln is a man of the 19th century, not the 20th century, and they're disappointed in that historic fact. So it comes and goes. It rises and falls. When Barack Obama ran for president, he stressed his connections through his home state of Illinois to the Lincoln legacy. Attention rises, then it tends to drop off at other times.
Mm-hmm. So is the dissatisfaction occur because of what's going on, because of the things that go on currently?
Well, there are always people dissatisfied with Lincoln. It's always a minor chord in the Lincoln story, but you can go back to the poet who wrote the Spoon River Anthology, Edgar Lee Masters, back in the 1930s. He hated Abraham Lincoln. John Tyler's grandson, I think it was, in the same era, just hated Abraham Lincoln and wrote about that. You can find a thread of extreme people today who dislike the federal government in all its forms and want to blame Abraham Lincoln for the size of today's federal government, even though historically that's not an accurate argument.
Well, tell us what is accurate. Tell us what is accurate.
Well, it's not accurate in the sense that the federal government grew enormously during the Civil War because there was a war to be fought, and that happens in all of America's wars. But it did not stay large. It tended to decline after that. The armies, of course, dissipated. So the growth of the federal government did not really begin, the modern federal government, until the Second World War, when it began to grow exponentially in terms of spending and numbers of people employed and so on. And that continued from that time on through the end of the 20th century and up to the present. So it was not Lincoln who started that path. He was president during a great bulge in federal spending and enterprise in order to win the Civil War. But that it was not a straight line to the present. It declined after that and grew again a century later.
So talk more about his personality and the Honest Abe thing. Like, what types of things showed up, events, situations that pointed to Abe being honest?
Well, that's one of the things that fascinates people about Lincoln. One of the many things is that his personal character, and this quality of honesty is really a remarkable one. It goes back to his youth. There's a legendary story of him walking miles to return change to a customer that he'd accidentally overcharged when he worked in a general store in New Salem, Illinois, as a young man. As far as research shows, that story is probably true. There is a 20th century written recollection of someone who said that it happened to their mother, I believe. But it's worth noting that Lincoln probably showed up at that person's house with the 2 cents overpayment that he was returning, probably right around supper time, and was probably invited to stay. And as a young man without many resources, living alone, he was happy to get a meal out of it. So there's truth both to the honesty, but also that Lincoln was not was also being realistic. Lincoln was honest about many things. He was honest about his personal appearance. He had no trouble making jokes about how he looked. People accused him of being ugly. When people said he wasn't honest, someone once accused him of being two-faced, and he famously said, if I had two faces, why would I wear this one? That was his style. He found that it was successful to simply be as honest as possible in most cases. Now, he's also a politician. That doesn't mean he tells everybody everything all the time. You can look in the Lincoln correspondence and find copies of letters he wrote to people that he said, this needs to be held in confidence, or even burn this letter at the end when you're done reading it. There were things that people in political conflict have to keep the other side from learning about. But he didn't dissemble. He was successful, he found, in simply, for the most part, telling people what he honestly thought, and making it easier to take, perhaps, by using humor, but not by trying to hide things.
What kind of employer was he?
What kind of employer was he? Well, he didn't employ people, really.
I mean, as far as being in the government, what was he like to work with?
Well, it's interesting because his White House staff consisted of two people. John Nicolay and John Hay were his two personal secretaries. Occasionally, William Stoddard, one or two others might be in the office. But compared to today's government, today's White House, he wasn't the boss of a lot of people. Now, of course, he's commander-in-chief of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But he had no administrative experience before he became president. He was in a law partnership throughout his legal career the last few years with William Herndon. So it was just the two of them, Lincoln and Billy Herndon, in an office in Springfield. So there's no one to manage there. He was Herndon's mentor more than anything else. And likewise with his two secretaries, he was a father figure to John Hay, who was younger, and who he called John, and just had a business-like relationship with John Nicolay, who he called Nicolay. I suppose the place to look for that would be his relationship with his generals. During the Civil War, of course, he had to command the Union armies by proxy by appointing someone to be the general-in-chief, and there he struggled for a number of years, appointing different people, most notably George McClellan, who were not successful and whom he had to relieve and replace. The common image we have of him doing that is that he was a hands-off leader. He allowed the generals to run things themselves, and that's not quite accurate. Early in the war, you can see Lincoln as a very hands-on leader, even a micromanager, telling generals where to move a specific regiment or a specific gunboat at a different time, far more direction than really ought to be given from above. Mm-hmm. But he learned the trade as the war went on. He learned to back away, to let the generals do what they wanted to do, and to give them the support they needed. There were a couple times during the war he flirted with the idea of taking command in person. He was as president the commander-in-chief. He could constitutionally do that, but he never actually did so. He always thought better of it, backed away, and simply, if he wasn't getting the right results, relieved one commander and appointed a different one.
Well, I guess his standards in being Honest Abe and being that way was so high that you had to stay involved. And it's kind of like, you can't tell somebody to do something you wouldn't do yourself.
That's true. He very much tried to set that example. During the draft in the Civil War, for example, Lincoln was, of course, not going to be drafted into the Army. He was the commander-in-chief already. But at that time, there was a provision in the law where if you were drafted, you could hire someone to serve in your place as a substitute. And Lincoln went and did that. He hired a man from Pennsylvania and paid him to serve in his place in the Union Army. It was a gesture. It was a way of showing that he was wanting to do what he would otherwise ask others to do. More significantly, when his son Robert, his eldest son, wanted to serve in the war, Mary Lincoln, his wife, was dead set against it. They'd already lost their boy Willie, the third son, in 1862. Probably typhoid fever killed him. And Mary did not want to lose Robert in the war as well. But Lincoln's view was, we're asking so many other American families to send their boys, we can't hold ours at home. And Lincoln found a way for Robert to serve on General Grant's staff and go to the front. So that's an example of Lincoln not asking others to do what he wasn't willing to do himself.
So that brings me to, in fact, Chris, who is our co-producer, had some questions to ask you. So I really did want to get into Lincoln as a family man, and one of her questions is going to pertain to that. So, what was Lincoln like as a family man?
Well, to some extent, it depends who you ask or which historian you read. In one of my books, I make the comment, half facetiously, that if you look at the home lives of the professors who write the books, the ones who are happiest seem to think that the Lincolns had the happiest life. And those maybe less successful tend to dwell on the frictions in the Lincoln household. You can find both. Abraham and Mary Lincoln had one marriage, didn't divorce or separate in any way. They wrote affectionate letters to each other when they were apart, when he was in Congress and she was back in Springfield, Illinois in the 1840s. But there's also testimony from neighbors back in the Springfield days of fights between the two, of Mary chasing Abraham around the backyard with a stick.
That must have been quite a sight.
Must have been a sight. It's hard to know what really was going on within the family. It's tough to judge. I don't think any of us would want our relationships judged by just what the neighbors could see and hear. So the result speaks for itself in that they stayed together, that through Mary's increasing physical disabilities as time went on, Abraham stayed certainly loyal to her. As a family man, Lincoln was an indulgent father. He was quite different from the Victorian model of the stern patriarch of the family. He let his boys run rather more roughshod in the office than his partner Billy Herndon thought was appropriate. He took care of them, played with them, generally indulged them in ways that fathers didn't do so much in those days. He was a very, very close father to his sons, Willie and Tad. Eddie, the second boy, died very young, so we don't know much about Eddie. And Robert, the oldest, was more distant, closer to his mother. During the Civil War, he was away at Harvard College and then away with General Grant. So, as he said after the war, I had scarcely 10 minutes conversation with my father throughout the whole war. So Abraham and Robert were not close, but with the other boys, very close.
So Willie, that was the question that Chris had, was about
Yes.
Willie, because she asked about that they had a party.
They did. It was February 1862. Mary had redecorated the White House. She'd been given an allowance from Congress. I'm trying to remember the exact number, $7,000 or $10,000, a lot of money.
Well, that's a lot of money.
A lot of money. But the White House, when they moved in, was, one observer said it had the air of a third-rate hotel. It was run down. The previous president, James Buchanan, was a bachelor, didn't spend much of his personal time taking care of the place. So Mary felt keenly that this ought to be a home befitting the head of state of the United States of America. And she was also under pressure to show that the Lincolns were not country bumpkins from Kentucky, where they were born, or from Illinois, from the Wild West, from a log cabin. She was under pressure to show that she was socially fit to mingle with the Southern belles of Washington, D.C. And she herself was born into wealth, well-educated, could speak French. She felt that she deserved to be treated on a level. So she took this money and really did a nice job redecorating the White House. She overspent her budget, in fact, which caused Lincoln, when he found out about it, to be outraged. Yeah. He said, it would stink in the nostrils of the American people for to spend all this money on flub dubs for this damned old house when the soldiers can't have enough blankets. He was willing to pay it out of his own pocket, the overrun. But it was politically and socially necessary that the White House be respectable, and Mary achieved that, and she held a great party to celebrate this in February 1862. But as bad luck would have it, Tad and Willie, the two young Lincoln sons, came down with an illness, probably, as I said, typhoid fever. The home was supplied with water from the Potomac River, and the Potomac River was also the open sewer for 100,000 men of the Army of the Potomac. So it was not healthy water. The boys got sick. Tad recovered, but Willie did not. He was very ill the night of the party. The two parents kept excusing themselves from their guests, going up and taking turns sitting by his bedside. It's just a heartbreaking scene. And when Willie died, Abraham was bereft. He would go into the room where Willie had lain every day. It was a Thursday, I believe. Every Thursday for several weeks, he would just spend the whole day in that room. Eventually, mastered himself. He had a war to conduct, a country to save, a nation to fight for. Mary, on the other hand, went into deep mourning for a year, which was appropriate by Victorian standards, and then went on from there, continuing to wear black. She was unable really ever to fully recover from the loss of their darling Willie.
How old was Willie then?
I can't remember. It was either 9 or 10 or 11.
Well, they'd already lost one son.
They'd lost one son back around 1850, and now this was the second son they were losing. Now, that's not uncommon.
It was
in this
not
era.
uncommon.
Sanitation was poor, lifespans were different. Many, if not most, American families had lost a child or a close family member, but it didn't make it any less painful, and it helps explain why Mary was so dead set against Robert Lincoln going off to fight in the Civil War.
Right. So let me ask you something. So as a professor, as a human being, as a man, when you study somebody, you get so close to someone, what is that like?
Well, it's interesting how much distance there still is. People will sometimes say, what made Lincoln so great? What was his secret? And if I knew, or if any of my colleagues knew, we'd be running for president. We'd be still teaching at the university. It's impossible to get to that that inner secret. And I think any professor who says he or she knows what it is, I'll be skeptical. We can read everything Lincoln wrote that survives. We can read the words of people who knew him that they wrote down at the time. We can read the memoirs of people who remembered meeting him. But we can't inhabit that era. And even if we were there, one of the attractions of Lincoln is how contradictory he was. He was humorous, but also prone to depression. He was gregarious and told jokes, but he was also, as Herndon called him once, the most shut-mouthed man he ever knew. He could be silent. He was deeply spiritual, but he never joined a church. There are so many ways in which he contradicts himself that he's really impossible to know.
So I want to chip away some of the things that you just said. So let's start with the spiritual part. How does that show up?
Well, it shows up in his public words, his speaking and writing, most dramatically, of course, in the second inaugural address. This comes 1865. The war is winding down. We know in retrospect there's another month and a little more before Lee will surrender at Appomattox. Lincoln doesn't know that, but the country does sense that Lee's army is at its last breath, that the Union will win the war. And Lincoln, in giving this inaugural address, having been triumphantly reelected, doesn't do an end zone dance, doesn't celebrate, doesn't cheer for victory, doesn't talk about how great he is or how great the Union is. He gives the country this meditation on what happened here. He talks about how American slavery, he says, everyone knew that was the cause of the war. Only later will people start to make up arguments that it was about states' rights or something else. But at the time, no one was deceived. And then he says American slavery is the sin that comes to us north and south, as for which this war is God's punishment, and that he is a just God. He quotes the Bible, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So as if it costs, if all the blood and toil lost in 250 years of unrequited toil by American slaves shall have to be lost in this war, if we have to lose the same number of lives, the same amount of treasure, he says, if that's the judgment of the Lord, who are we to complain? So he's not celebrating. He's recognizing that there's a providence beyond human understanding that has brought about this terrible war, that he has to lead the country through it, that it's both sides' fault. There's to be no celebrating in the North, that the South is to be part of the American nation as it always was when the war is over, with malice toward none, charity for all. So clearly, this is someone who understands that there's a power beyond what we see on Earth.
So, is there indication that Lincoln was creative in doing anything creative? Like, what did he do with his spare time?
Well, certainly as president, he didn't have any. I think it's safe to say. As a young man, he wrote poetry. There are several poems of his survive. There may be several more that were published anonymously. Michael Burlingame's professor has done a lot of study of Lincoln's anonymous journalism as a young man. But Lincoln, yes, he wrote poetry. As president, he didn't write poems as such, but there was certainly poetry in the language of the Second Inaugural, or in the language of the Gettysburg Address, or even in the language of private letters that he wrote. The one to Fanny McCulloch, a young woman whose father was killed in the war. And as Lincoln said, she seemed to be grieving more than is normal in such cases. And he writes her a letter of consolation that is just beautiful in its language and its human understanding and compassion. So language is where Lincoln's creativity is fully displayed.
I mean, I'm just listening to what you're saying, and I'm envisioning this man who, when you have all of those characteristics, regardless of that it was back in the Victorian days or it's today, when you have all those characteristics, you tend to be tormented by the same thing that brings you delight. In other words, you care about everything. And because you care about everything, you're tormented by it. You take things literally, and at the same, which is then there's the truth and honesty, and the same things that torment you. As it's so interesting to listen to you talk about this man that I can see being just such a certain way and so clear.
It's an interesting question about to think about Lincoln in that way. Lincoln suffered from torment, maybe, I think that's the right word, very visibly at certain times in his life. We know, for example, after Anne Rutledge, the tavern keeper's daughter in New Salem, where Lincoln lived as a young man, after her death, Lincoln went into a deep, deep depression for a number of days. Again, in 1841, when simultaneously his engagement to Mary Todd seemed to be breaking up, and his best friend Joshua Speed was married and moving away, Lincoln went into another very deep depression. So much he wrote to someone, if what I feel now could be bottled up and a drop administered to everyone in the world, there would not be a single smiling face. Uh, he was extremely depressed at these times. After Willie's death, as I mentioned, he suffered this. So he felt, yes, he felt loss very keenly, very deeply. He was able to master it. Certainly, by the time he was president, he was able to compartmentalize that grief over Willie's loss and carry on his business while also carrying this deep hurt. I don't think, from my reading, and I'm not a medical doctor, don't pretend to be one, the argument has been made by Joshua Schenck and others that Lincoln suffered from clinical depression, that he saw everything through the gray fog of depression that is part of that disease. I'm not sure that the evidence bears that out. His moments of desperate loss or desperate pain follow moments of desperate loss. They're not chronic. So I'm not sure it's reasonable to argue. I'm not persuaded that he suffered from clinical depression, but he certainly did suffer torment. I think you're very perceptive in recognizing that.
Yeah. Well, when you have, I mean, listening to what you're telling me, you have those ups and downs.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to, when you're, as you're talking, he was a feeling kind of guy. And when you have those ups and downs and that, touches your emotional state, you're going to feel it. Another question just came to me is, if I said to you, what we learned from Lincoln was, what would you fill in the blank with?
Well, it's hard to be that reductive. I don't think I can come down to a single thing. I do think there are different levels on which to answer that. As a person, in terms of character, we can learn from his honesty. That seems to have served him well in his relationships as well as a political leader. As a leader, his devotion to his ideals, to the Union, and ultimately to the equality of all Americans, certainly the political equality, was something he did not compromise. He was willing to maneuver, to take a step back, to make two steps forward later. He was not dogmatic. He was not moralistic or ideologically pure. Maybe that's perhaps the one lesson we could take from him politically today, is that he did not draw a line and say everyone must agree with this or you're out. Everyone must be loyal to me personally or you're out. Rather, he maneuvered, he took advantage of what was possible at a given time. One of his quotes famously is, "My policy is to have no policy." In other words, he was not wedded to one way of doing things. He never took his eye off the ball, which was to reunite the country and to do it without the scourge of slavery. He stayed fast to those two principles throughout his presidency. But as to how he would get there, if you had a good idea and it was better than his, he was willing to drop his idea and take yours.
Fascinating guy.
Absolutely.
Really cool. Yeah, really, really cool. I mean, when you're in school, you don't get this opportunity necessarily as just going to school, So this is really cool. I'm glad you're bringing these up. So with the party, there was a question I wanted to ask you, which I think lends itself to some of what we're talking about, the deeper soul of this man, not the deeper soul, but the deepness of this man to his soul. When he made a promise, he was going to keep it. And if he made Chris was wondering, how did they have this party when their son was dying? Well, he didn't make it about himself. It was more about the party, what it represented. It was about the White House. It wasn't just about himself.
No, that's absolutely true. It was not simply a personal celebration. It was not for his own benefit. It had political ramifications. It was going to go forward. And he then, and certainly later, saw Willie's loss as the loss that thousands of American families were experiencing across the country, North and South, to lose a beloved son, not in battle. In this case, Willie was just a boy, but he didn't feel that his loss was especially privileged, that he was any different from these other families who were suffering these painful losses as well. So, no, in that sense, he could hardly say, cancel the party. My loss is so special. We're not going to have one. Right. Now, people criticize the party happening at all, given that there were thousands of families mourning everywhere. And that was, there was very harsh criticism in the press from some quarters about the decision to do that. But as I said earlier, there were political reasons why it seemed appropriate to show that this was a presidency that was worthy of the title.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, so Civil War, and then I just want to remind everyone, I've gotten so engrossed in this conversation, believe it or not. It's interesting because it's a different kind of conversation to have, and so I'm really listening, and it's not just it's deep. So anyway, 919-518-9773 is our number right into the studio. Please feel free to call in anytime you want to engage with us. And computers, that's plural 2K voice, if you'd like to come in on Skype voice, not a picture. And then again, you're welcome to join us in our chat and ask questions, comment, whatever you like to Jerry about history. Abe Lincoln, I want to talk some about the Civil War.
Sure.
How are we engaging in a civil war now? Are we? And are there elements of now relating to back in the Civil War?
Well, first, no, we're not engaged in the Civil War now. The Civil War of 1861, 1865 claimed 750,000 lives. We are not anywhere approaching that level of conflict within our country. And it's absurd exaggeration to compare domestic political conflict today to that kind of bloodshed. Having said that, I would say that the level of political conflict in terms of discourse has certainly ratcheted up significantly, so that the question you ask is not a ridiculous question. 10 years ago, it would have been a ridiculous question.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, 10 years ago, there were the idea that Americans could ever return to the idea of hating one another to the point of advocating a mass slaughter of fellow Americans. That could never happen again after Appomattox. Unfortunately, we now do hear on the fringes people talking about that kind of behavior. I'm not a political analyst, and I get out of my depth if I start talking about contemporary politics. I have strong and absolutely correct opinions about contemporary politics, but I'm here to talk about. But the reason I'm here is to talk about what I've studied professionally, which is the past. The past is not a mirror. It's not a crystal ball, I should say. It is a mirror. It can reflect things. It can help us see the present more clearly, but it doesn't tell us what's going to happen next. It is distressing to see the level of anger and condemnation, vituperation in modern political discourse that does take you back to what people were writing and saying in 1860. And since we know what that led to in 1860, we ought to be smarter than that today and not be so free. Technology today, though, allows us to say things with no consequence, to hide our identities while saying them, and encourages a kind of violence in language that we haven't seen quite on the same level since the 1850s.
So where are you taking your study of Lincoln next? Is there a certain area that you're focusing on next?
Um, not, no, actually.
Okay.
I'm thinking my writing interest is moving back to where I started, the Civil War itself, and writing about the the military aspects of the conflict. My first book was about the Army of the Ohio, which was one of the Union armies that fought in the Western Theater in Kentucky and Tennessee in 1861 and 1862. And I have some thought of returning to that topic. Um,
Mm. Well, you have your book with you, right? So you could hold it up and show us both
Now,
your
this
books.
book,
Yes.
absolutely,
Yep.
this reflects what we've been talking about today. The title is Did Lincoln Own Slaves? And Other Frequently Asked Questions About Abraham Lincoln. At the risk of spoiling future sales, I will tell you no, Lincoln did not own slaves. But people ask questions like that. And when I worked at the Lincoln Museum for nearly a decade, I heard many, many questions about Abraham Lincoln, and they fascinated me. The things that people wanted to know that were not necessarily the same things professors were writing about. Uh, that's what I wanted to put between the covers of this book. So essentially, it's a biography in question and answer form that answers many questions about Lincoln, some of the ones that you and I have talked about today, and a lot of others. So it was a chance for me to share the kind of discussion you and I are having with between covers of a book, and that continues to interest me. I've had the opportunity for the last 15 years to host a podcast of my own. It's not a video one like you do, but an audio podcast called Civil War Talk Radio. And through that medium, I've had 15 years of talking to authors about what they've written about the Civil War and a chance to see how the scholarship has changed. One of the things that's true both of Lincoln, the Civil War, and any historical topic is that it doesn't sit still. The past itself, of course, can't change, but the angle that we have for looking at it changes every day as we get farther away, or as we discover new sources or new technologies to learn about the past, or have new experiences that make us rethink our understanding of the past. We're always
Right.
evolving our ideas. That's why history is never done. So I've had 15 years of seeing how Civil War history has evolved, and I'm thinking that that may be the next research direction, to look at the evolution of Civil War history and Lincoln history over the past decade and a half as we move into the times you mentioned today that are so striking in some
Right.
ways to their resemblance to the Civil War period.
And your students, what do they seem to be most interested in?
The First, let me say what a pleasure it is teaching students at East Carolina University. I really do enjoy working with them. The There's no one direction. I ask students what questions they have about Lincoln when I start a course on the Civil War era, just to see what they say, and it tends to follow what the general public is interested in. But we had here at East Carolina in the last several years a controversy over the name of one of our residence halls, which was named for a early governor of North Carolina who led the move to disenfranchise Black voters around 1900, but who also did wonderful things in building a public education in the state. And it was a great lesson in the complexity of history. Here's someone who did something that we all approve of, growth of public education, and something else we all disapprove of, disenfranchising Black voters and arguing for white supremacy. So how do you remember someone like that who isn't all good or all bad? Do you honor them with a building name? Do you dishonor them by taking down the building name? Or can you find a middle ground, was what we tried to do here at ECU. But that's the kind of thing that students certainly got interested in, talking about, learning about the past and seeing how it applied to their own circumstances here in the 21st century.
Right. Amnon's got a question for you.
Sure.
Jerry, I'm sitting here thinking, and I'm into technology.
Mhm.
is it possible, and not meaning to pop anybody's bubble, is it possible that if back in his days we had the social media that we have today, that he would be remembered as a whole different bad person, did all this? Because people always tend to remember the bad things you did. They don't concentrate on the good things that you did. And social media, like he said today, I mean, social media amplifies it. So
It,
could he have enjoyed time without social media, and that's why maybe he wasn't really honest, but nobody really took? I mean, is that a possibility? Did anybody ever research that?
well, I think that's a great question. Definitely, social media changes politics dramatically. I would say, had there been a revolutionary technology in Lincoln's day, that the odds are he would have found a way to deal with it. And the example we have for that is photography. Photography was a new technology invented 1840s. It starts to become widespread. Uh, by the 1850s, it's very widespread, but still not something that can be reproduced in newspapers. You have to buy a separate photograph of something. But they become very popular. People collect cartes de visite, these little baseball card sized photos of both their loved ones that they put in an album. But you can also buy cartes de visite of politicians and other military leaders, put those in your family album too. Lincoln understood photography as a medium to connect with the public. And he had himself photographed many, many times while president. As busy as he was, he took time to have his likeness taken, as they said,
That's so
which was a big
interesting.
deal.
Yes.
In contrast, where there's approximately 130 different poses of Lincoln taken during his lifetime. Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederate States of America, maybe one photograph taken during the Civil War. He was too busy. Lincoln understood, no, this isn't a waste of my time. This is how I will connect with the American people, let them see who I am, see where I am and what I'm doing. So Lincoln understood this technology and used it to his advantage to make himself better in touch with the public. Now, had there been social media, another new technology, would he have found a way also to adopt to that? I think it's likely. Even in his speeches, the conventional political speech of his day lasted for hours. When he gave his debates with Senator Douglas in the 1858 campaign, he talked for hours. That was what you did. But when he gave the Gettysburg Address, he talked for 2 minutes. It was a soundbite, practically. The second inaugural that we talked about earlier is one of the shortest inaugural speeches in American history. He knew how to compress meaning. Could he do it in 140 characters if he had to? We don't know. But he certainly compressed it into a way that no other speaker had done before, and no one has really done since. So my answer to that is I think the evidence is there that he mastered other revolutionary technologies. Would he have handled social media likewise? We can never know, but there's evidence to say he would have found a way.
That's very interesting. God knows history is such a wonderful jigsaw puzzle. I mean, I love it. I love hearing how how you take it and you can just imagine what was happening. I mean, it's just fabulous. So, okay, I know before the show ends, I want you to tell everybody certainly where they can find your book. We did not say that.
Did Lincoln Own Slaves, published by Vintage Civil War Library, part of Random House. So you can order it through Amazon or Barnes and Noble or any of the other big book vendors. It's certainly out there in paperback. And if you do, send me an email here at East Carolina University. Tell me what you think of it. I'm happy to always hear from readers. Likewise, Civil War Talk Radio. If you Google that phrase, it'll be the first thing that comes up.
When are you on? When are you on?
The podcast is produced live each Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time through a website called Voice America, all one word. So you can hear it live at voiceamerica.com on Wednesday evenings, but you can also download it from Apple, from iTunes, from Shoutcast. What are all the other ones? iHeartRadio, all the other podcast places also have it. It's no cost. Download it for free. There are 400 episodes plus as of our talk today in March of 2019, so you can enjoy hearing my voice for 400 consecutive years if you want.
Terrific. Well, we are going to let you go because I know you have to get to a meeting. So it's been delightful to have you. Don't anybody leave yet. But it's been very delightful to have you. And thank you for your time and for your honesty. Honest Jerry.
Well, Adnan and Marilyn, thank you both very much for having me
It's
on.
been
I
a
really
pleasure.
appreciate it. And,
Thanks for coming.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you. We'll be in touch for sure.
Look forward to it.
Absolutely. So history is so cool, isn't it? I mean, and the notion of the photography, he was a people person. Abe Lincoln was a people person. He knew how to connect. He knew how important it was to connect in a way that was, you know, kind of like heart to heart in his own way.
Right. I mean, he knew how to use what he had.
Yes.
But my question went by the wayside.
Right.
My question was actually, how would social media affect
Him,
him?
not
How
he
they
would have
would
used
look
it.
at him,
Oh, I see.
not how he would use it, is how they would use it against him, like they're doing it today
Well,
with it seems like that in the last 30 years or so, every president has it worse and worse and worse because of the media. And it seems like they always stick to the bad things. It doesn't matter how much good you do, they stick to the bad things because they know that it's more sensational. And I'm wondering if he would have been remembered as Honest Abe.
I think
if
so.
there was.
I don't think he would.
We'd like to believe so.
I don't think he was as tainted as we've gotten.
And again,
And
we
I think,
don't know it.
Well, but
that's the problem.
Right. But here's the thing: you can look at. I mean, I'm not a historian, but based on what he was saying and the things that he did that showed honesty, that's who the man was, and he wasn't as tainted. I mean, he was honest. So, I mean, I would like to think that social media would have picked up that period. But anyway, very interesting to listen to the to history and to see why, because I'm always curious why people talk about him. Honest Abe, yes, but why else? I mean, what is it about him that we get to learn from? And it's really also nice. I'm going to believe that he was honest, and it's nice to know what we were built on, what America stood for, what America stands for, I guess is what I want to say. So it's very, very interesting. So you have my book up there? Okay, here we go. So here are my books on Amazon. In Just One Afternoon, Listening to the Hearts of Men, which you're going to find a lot of Abe kind of men in my book. Actually, they're all kind of Abe men. They're all men expressing themselves and being honest. So that is In Just One Afternoon, Listening to the Hearts of Men, and In Just One Afternoon, Listening to the Hearts of Twins. Are phenomenal stories, relationships about twins, experiencing life as a twin, and all the things that go with it, whether it's parenting, sibling rivalry, conflict, love, compassion, and life as a twin is extremely interesting and a lot of good stuff for us all to learn from and share. And soon, very soon, hopefully, I will have In Just One Afternoon, Listening to the Hearts of Millennials up there. So if I can be of any service to any of you anytime, please feel free to reach out to Marilyn at MarilynShannon.com. If you have an idea for a show or anything you want to discuss with me, I'd love to have you. Please look at us on YouTube. You can find our former videos there. You can see us on Facebook, Marilyn Shannon, Marilyn and and Breaking Free Show. Nissan Communication is there. You will see lots of good stuff. So with that, it's been fabulous to have you here. I wish you a wonderful, wonderful week, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.